Committee on Housing and Insurance will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled Restoring Prosperity in American Communities, Examining the Failures of the Status Quo Housing Policy. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. Today's hearing about restoring prosperity in American communities by examining the failures of status quo housing policy. This is an important topic that we have correctly devoted a lot of attention to in this Congress and, frankly, in previous Congresses. Thus far, over the last 12 months, the subcommittee has held 6 hearings exploring various aspects of how everyday Americans are having their lives impacted by bad government decisions and failed federal policies on housing. The result is reduced prosperity, reduced customer choice, and reduced optimism that things are going to get better anytime soon. People aren't believing that it's really transitory. Making matters worse, as we will hear from testimony today, is the alarming notion that the local input in the process doesn't even matter or isn't necessary. In fact, sometimes it's treated as a barrier. Instead of working collaboratively with local mayors, supervisors, and other county officials to balance the needs of residents in their own communities, all too often bureaucrats, whether in state governments like Albany or in Washington, D.C., want to impose mandates on places like Orangetown, Nyack, New York City, Cincinnati, Middletown, Lincoln, Nebraska. Ironically, it's the local citizens who are forced to implement their overreaching and excessively expensive policies, and to add insult into injury, they're the ones that end up footing the bill. So, by the way, these same bureaucrats say that anyone who opposes these ideas isn't just wrong, they're mean-spirited and selfish people. But simply put, bureaucrats pushing these ideas don't really care about what local residents think. They have an agenda, and they're seeking to push it, and it's almost like no matter what, they're inclined to not listen. So today, hopefully, we'll give voice to local communities and a more wide-ranging set of views. So in Congress, every member is dealing with some aspect of affordable housing. Members of our committee are particularly focused on legislation that provides solution. I especially want to thank my colleagues Mike Flood from Nebraska and Mike Lawler, who many of you know locally. They've been some of the most committed members on housing policy, hosting roundtables in their districts and advancing legislation to try to address the issues. So for our 7th hearing, we decided to travel to New York, to our colleague Mike Lawler's district, so that we could see firsthand the impacts that poorly designed, heavy-handed federal, state, and local housing mandates are having. Folks in Rockland County find themselves in a situation that's become all too common in areas around the country. Housing's already been too expensive, and now inventory is limited. Lawmakers' response to forced mandates sounds good on paper, but ends up hurting affordability and availability for residents most in need. These impacts are real. I look forward to addressing them with our witnesses today. And so today I would like to welcome the testimony of Mr. Ralph Amicucci. Mr. Amicucci of Amicucci Associates, PC, is here on behalf of the Institute of Real Estate Management, the New York chapter. The Honorable Teresa Kenny, she's the supervisor of the town of Orangetown, New York. Mr. John Ketcham. Mr. Ketcham is a fellow and director of cities at the Manhattan Institute. And Ms. Leah Goodridge. She is the managing attorney for housing policy at Mobilization for Justice. So we thank you for taking the time to be here today. Without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. Mr. Amicucci, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give your oral remarks.
Chairman Davidson and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here to testify at this important hearing. My name is Ralph Amicucci. I am the managing partner of Amicucci Associates, PC, attorneys at law, concentrating in real estate. Our firm concentrates its real estate practice in areas of landlord-tenant matters, buy and sell transactions, bank representation, commercial leasing, and representation in front of the New York State Division of Housing and Community Renewal. I'm an active member of the Institute of Real Estate Management, IREM, where I am a certified instructor. I hold the Certified Property Manager, CPM designation, and I serve as Vice President of Education for the New York chapter. I am also an adjunct assistant professor of real estate accounting at New York University's Schack Real Estate Institute and in the Civil Engineering Department at NYU's Tandem School of Engineering, as well as an adjunct professor in the accounting department of Manhattan College in the Bronx, New York. Today, in more and more communities, hardworking Americans are unable to rent or buy homes due to increased housing costs. These rising costs are driven by a lack of supply created by barriers to development and burdensome laws currently in existence that increasingly make it extremely challenging to build housing at almost any price point, particularly at affordable to low and middle class families. The total share of cost-burdened households, thus paying more than 30% of their income to housing, increased steadily from 28% in 1985 to 36.9% in 2021, while other households have been priced out of the communities altogether in their search for affordable housing. This is not sustainable, particularly in a period of high inflation. It's crucial that we start now to enact policies that will incentivize new housing production. As Congress examines approaches to address housing affordability, I implore the committee not to use failed state-level housing policies as a prototype. Many states, including New York, have enacted policies that have an adverse effect on the creation of affordable housing units and current conditions of existing housing. I would like to specifically address the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, the HSTPA, which was passed in New York in 2019, that negatively affects renters and discourages affordable housing development. The HSTPA removed virtually all incentives for owners to renovate rent-stabilized apartments vacated by long-term tenants. This resulted in more than 30,000 units remaining vacant. The HSTPA capped the amount of individual apartment improvements at $15,000 over 30 years, which translated to about $83 a month of additional rent, when the true cost to rehab a unit is approximately $100,000 to $150,000. The HSTPA also removed vacancy decontrol, which allowed owners to raise rents to market when the tenant vacated the apartment. No municipality has vacancy control. In the 2019 law essentially states that if a renter leaves an apartment, no matter what happens, the rent stays the same. Even California, with the perception of being very punitive against property rights, an owner can reset the rent when it becomes vacant. Stabilized rents in New York City buildings are set each year by the Rent Guidelines Board, which voted in June for a 3% increase for one-year leases and a 2.75% increase for the first year of a two-year lease and 3.2% for the second year of a two-year lease. However, fuel, utilities, labor, maintenance, administrative costs, insurance, taxes, rent-stabilized multifamily buildings rose by 8.1% from April 2022 to March 2023. Instead of looking at New York, I would recommend members of the committee immediately act on the following measures, and that my colleagues and I believe will have a positive impact on housing affordability and help increase the nation's housing supply. I'm running out of time, so the four areas that I would recommend would be the choice of Affordable Housing Act, S32 and HR 4606, the Low Income Housing Tax Credit, or LIHTC, and the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, HR 3238 and S1557, and then eliminate exclusionary zoning and harmful land use policies, and then incentivize adapted reuse of underutilized commercial properties. Chairman Davidson, Ranking Member Cleary, the members of this committee, thank you again for providing myself and IREM the opportunity to testify here today. I look forward to answering your questions.
Now recognize Ms. Kenny for her opening statements.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me here today to offer some remarks on the housing crisis in New York, something that is happening in communities throughout the United States in one degree or another. Although I have no particular expertise on the subject matter, my background and experience give me a unique perspective and insight on the topic. I'm a practicing lawyer for over 33 years, specializing in real estate and municipal law. In 2019, I was elected town supervisor for the town of Orangetown, and I just started my third term. Orangetown is the southernmost town in Rockland County, located approximately 30 miles north of New York City, and per the 2020 census has a population of just under 49,000 and 18,724 housing units. Over the last 2 years, under my leadership and with the help of professional planners, the town board undertook the task of updating the Orangetown Comprehensive Plan. One of the stated goals of the plan was to come up with ways to try to alleviate the housing shortage, hopefully helping with the affordability issue. Going through this process helped me to gain a better understanding of the issues from a more localized level. But more important than all of that is that I am a mother of 2 young adults, aged 27 and 29, both whom are currently renting because they cannot afford to purchase a home of their own. Moreover, I have watched as their friends and colleagues have moved out of New York to places like North Carolina, Colorado, Pennsylvania, and Tennessee for jobs in locations that are much more affordable to live, and it's very likely that these young New Yorkers will not return. As to what is causing the housing crisis, it is complicated, and there are several factors at play. Sadly, there's no quick or easy answer on how to fix it. I will start with how I believe it got started. Well, there's already a bit of an affordability issue before COVID. It was made significantly worse when COVID hit. Thousands of New York City residents, now able to work from anywhere, fled the city and relocated to the suburbs, creating a huge shortage of homes and driving up the sales prices even higher. It was a simple case of supply and demand, and it happened throughout the entire region. Further fueling the shortage and rising home prices is that many seniors, like myself, are opting to age in place. With their mortgages paid off and the cost of renting so high, it is simply more cost-effective to remain in their homes, removing these properties from an inventory that might otherwise be available. Similarly, young couples in their starter homes with a 3% interest rate are not moving to larger homes due to the increased interest rates and house prices. Another factor affecting affordability that cannot be ignored in New York State is the high real estate taxes. Using a homeowner in Orangetown with a home appraised at a market value of $612,000, the tax burden is approximately $14,000 a year, adding another $1,167 to their monthly costs. Factor that in with high interest rates and home prices, and many people just cannot afford it. Another obstacle facing municipalities is their outdated zoning laws, most of which were adopted many, many years ago. These laws traditionally call for single-family homes, separate and far away from any downtown or commercial areas. To this day, town boards across New York State, including my town board, are hesitant to change zones or approve projects that are not consistent with this outdated zoning approach. Any mention of multifamily, cluster, or mixed-use housing is frowned upon and seen as too urban by many. Any talk of transit-oriented development, which allows more density by train stations, is rejected outright. However, what those pushing single-family homes as the only means to address the housing shortage need to understand is that even a builder can find land, the approval process in New York is expensive and lengthy, adding to an already high cost of new construction. With fees from everything from the building permit to the land use board applications and consultants, these added costs in terms of both dollars and time are what deter many builders from building single-family homes. Add in supply-side challenges that are just now recovering from COVID and a tight job market, and it's clear that the single-family housing market will not be solving the housing shortage any day soon. While the causes of the problem are to some extent obvious, the more difficult question is what can be done to solve them and to foster more housing growth. I will start by saying clearly and unequivocally that any proposals coming from the state or federal government should be in the form of an incentive. 2 years ago, local officials across New York State were 100% against Governor Hochul's proposal to mandate the legalization of accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, with absolutely no consideration for local issues such as parking, traffic, water, and sewer. And while I applaud Governor Hochul for wanting to help with the problem, New York State officials should be looking to work with local elected officials, not against them. She should rely upon those elected by the community, as they are best suited to know what will or will not work in their respective communities. And I will say without hesitation that local governments need to step up to the plate. They need to look for ways to streamline the approval process and to amend outdated zoning and planning laws to allow for more flexible and dense housing styles in non-traditional settings. They must engage with the public and educate them on the need to adapt to a changing landscape, to reinvent our notion of what a home looks like. So whether it's the repurposing of a mall or an office building or the creation of mixed-use zones that combine residential and commercial use, we must find innovative ways to increase the housing inventory and affordability. While the housing shortage and affordability problem is complicated, I believe that with all levels of government working together, with an understanding and respect for the very important role the local government plays, there's a path to solving the problem. As a town supervisor and a mother, this is your priority for me, and I look forward to working with my counterparts in government to find solutions. I thank you for your time today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Supervisor Kenny. Mr. Ketcham, you're now recognized for 5 minutes for your oral statement.
Chairman Davidson and honorable members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is John Ketcham, and I am a fellow and director of cities at the Manhattan Institute, where my colleagues and I produce research and advocacy aimed at keeping America and its great cities prosperous, safe, and free. Throughout its 400-year history, New York City and its surrounding area have provided countless opportunities to immigrants and natives alike, helping to shape the concept of what it means to be an American and achieve the American dream. But New York's promise is under grave threat from its ever-worsening housing affordability and supply crisis. Just this month, the New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey revealed that the city's overall rental vacancy rate plunged to 1.4%, the lowest level since 1968. Today, about 52% of city renters pay 30% or more of their pre-tax income on rent. Unaffordable housing prices tell those who dream of making it in New York that the city has no room for their dreams. By driving away invaluable human capital to areas with lower housing costs, New York's policies are hampering not only its prosperity, but the nation's too. One study found the failure to build enough housing in high-productivity cities like New York reduced aggregate U.S. growth by 36% between 1964 and 2009. In short, all Americans are poorer because of New York's housing policies. The fundamental problem is one that Americans of all political persuasions can agree on. Too few new housing units are being built in and around New York City relative to demand. Between 2009 and 2019, the city added approximately 3.9 jobs for every housing unit permitted. Numerous decades-old government policies hamper new housing supply, with a combined effect greater than the sum of the parts. Restrictive zoning requirements, such as use limitations, parking mandates, building size and lot coverage restrictions, and large minimum lot sizes, limit construction and drive housing prices higher. New York City's rent stabilization law and its 2019 amendments have not addressed the supply shortage and have likely worsened vacancy rates. The state legislature's repeated failure to reauthorize a property tax abatement program for large new rental developments in New York City risks severely curtailing private investment in rental housing. At the same time, political realities dictate that New Yorkers, like Americans elsewhere, cherish their existing communities. Homeowners and long-term tenants do not wish to see wide-scale, sudden, and disruptive changes to the places they call home. Constituents and political leaders from both major parties value local control over most land use decisions. So to alleviate today's crushing housing burdens, New York State and its local governments must loosen restrictions and facilitate new housing construction. Options are available that would allow for more supply without substantially infringing on local control over land use, including the following. The state legislature could grant homeowners the right to build an accessory dwelling unit, or ADU, on their properties, which would allow them the freedom and flexibility to use their property as they see fit, such as to house a relative or to earn additional income. State law could also reauthorize a property tax incentive for large rental developments in New York City, lift the 12 cap on residential floor area ratio, streamline office-to-residential conversions in newer buildings, and exempt most residential upzonings from costly and time-consuming environmental reviews. The Adams administration has proposed constructive measures to eliminate parking mandates, allow ADUs and more office-to-residential conversions, and upzone residence districts citywide to allow gradually for more housing supply where there is demand for it. For its part, the federal government can foster new housing production without infringing on traditional boundaries of federalism by reforming tax cost recovery. Shortening depreciation schedules or adjusting depreciation deductions for inflation are ways of reducing the net cost of development, encouraging greater private housing investment. Though daunting, New York's housing challenges are not a matter of technical infeasibility, but of political will to adopt the policies necessary to build more housing. Time is of the essence. New York's long-run competitiveness, and most importantly, the well-being of its residents are at stake. Thank you, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ketcham. Ms. Goodridge, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to give your oral statement.
Chairman Davidson and honorable members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning. My name is Leah Goodridge, and I'm the managing attorney for housing policy at Mobilization for Justice, one of the largest legal service providers in New York. In my role, I supervise a team of lawyers who represent low-income tenants facing eviction. In the last 12 years, I have litigated on behalf of hundreds of tenants, an experience which has afforded me a front-line view of the housing crisis. I also determine housing policy in New York. In 2018, former New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio appointed me to the New York City Rent Guidelines Board, which determines rent levels for rent-regulated apartments. There, I read reports and data, heard from experts, and both tenants and landlords alike. For the nearly 4 years that I was on the board, I saw how rent stabilization operated in policy and practice. We're here today to examine the failures of status quo housing policy, and New York is the ideal place to center this discussion. This is an opportunity to examine what works and what doesn't work. Rent stabilization works. It works to directly address the housing crisis by ensuring that some apartments remain affordable. Currently, many of the eviction cases that I'm seeing are in private, unregulated apartments. Recently, I spoke with Ms. P. She's 62 years old with physical disabilities. She's been living in a private, unregulated apartment for the last 7 years, but her landlord recently decided not to renew the lease. From the landlord's accord, she's up to date with rent, and there have been no disagreements. Yet, this is how it works when housing isn't regulated. Tenants like Ms. P become ensnared in a vicious housing market that likely won't yield an equally affordable apartment. And now, predictably, she is facing eviction with nowhere else to go. Ms. P's experience is a direct response to critics who argue that rent stabilization shouldn't exist at all. Relying entirely on the private market for all housing would create instability in the housing market. Now let's talk about if Ms. P's apartment was in fact rent stabilized. For one, her landlord would have to evict her based on whether she breached the lease or not. And second, she would likely be eligible for 2 programs which freeze her rent. This is the Disability Rent Exemption Increase Program, or the Senior Citizen Rent Increase Exemption Program, which freezes her rent at the current rate while providing property owners with a tax exemption. This is what New York City gets right, and this model should be replicated elsewhere. I also just want to quickly note that when we are talking about new apartments and new housing that's being built, most of it is not rent stabilized. So our rent stabilized stock is sort of fixed as it is. So when we're talking about new housing, it mostly includes mandatory inclusionary housing, that's 30%, that is not rent stabilized. Building housing without adequately investing in affordable housing does not work. So I want to briefly talk about some issues with affordable housing. For one, a lot of my clients cannot access newly built affordable housing. This is for a few reasons. First, most income-restricted units are devoted to moderate-income residents, not extremely low-income. Affordable housing used to be called low-income housing because that's the income target it achieved. However, there is a chart from the mayor's recent report that shows that extremely low-income units comprise the least of all of the income-restricted units for started and completed housing projects in the fiscal year of 2023. Working-class people who are vital to the prosperity of American communities, these are delivery workers, taxi drivers, home health aides, are on the margins of it with little safety net to help them from falling into the abyss. Let me provide a perspective. Sometimes a lot of affordable housing that is available, the income might start at $60,000. It might start at $80,000 to be eligible to even get into an affordable housing, and these are the income-restricted units. Sometimes the actual rent is $2,000 for a studio in the Bronx. And so this is where we talk about investing in affordable housing, it needs to be adequate, because when we have this being relied on completely by private developers, sometimes they say, I don't have enough money so that we can actually have more of these deeply affordable units. And this is where government can invest more in affordable housing. It won't work if it is entirely on private developers to do. And that is my time. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I have so much more to say, but I guess I'll say later.
Thank you, Ms. Goodridge. Appreciate your testimony. Thank you to all of our witnesses. I'd also like to recognize Mr. Lawler for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us here today at our field hearing here in Rockland County. I want to thank County Executive Ed Day and our Chairman of the County Legislature, Jay Hood, for allowing us to use the county office building today for this hearing. I'd also like to recognize some of our elected officials who are here. County Legislator Paul Cleary, County Legislator Will Kennelly, County Legislator Jesse Malowitz, County Legislator Aaron Weeder, Deputy Mayor of the Village of Haverstraw, Gil Carlavaro, Pomona Mayor Elon Fuchs, County Executive Ed Day's Chief of Staff John Lyon, the Deputy County Executive Mike Hoblin, our Commissioner of the Department of Social Services Joan Silvestri, and we also have representatives from Senator Bill Weber's office and Assemblyman John McGowan's office as well. So thank you all for joining us. One of the most common refrains that I hear when discussing housing with residents of the 17th District are their concerns about the affordability of housing. It remains a persistent challenge, with mortgage rates near their highest since the turn of the millennium, a limited housing supply in many communities, ongoing supply chain and construction issues, and high taxes. As we all know, in Rockland and Westchester counties, we pay among the highest property taxes in America. It is perhaps the most difficult time to purchase a home in our region's history. And this is true in many places across the country right now, thanks in part to the out-of-control spending that was pushed in Washington and in Albany, which helped drive record inflation. Over $5 trillion in new spending was signed off on by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle during just a 2-year span, leading to sky-high interest and mortgage rates, which has put many seeking housing on the back foot. The housing crunch is further complicated by the fact that many homeowners remain unable or unwilling to sell their home for fear of losing their fixed low-rate mortgages obtained prior to 2022. This is causing the limited supply to increase price, while also seeing home sales fall over 16% in 2023 compared to 2022. The median cost to purchase a home is more than 5.6 times greater than the median household income nationwide. In Rockland and Westchester counties, according to the National Association of Realtors, the monthly cost of a mortgage was $1,000 more in 2023 than it was in 2022. And in Putnam and Dutchess counties, it was at least $800 more per month. In both instances, these are additional housing costs of almost $10,000 or more a year. For many families, that is unsustainable. When you look at some of the other challenges we are dealing with in an area like the Hudson Valley, infrastructure, water, sewer, roads, bridges, schools, personnel, we are reliant on a all-volunteer fire service here, EMS, police. All of this plays a role in the ability and the availability of building new housing stock. When you look at what the governor proposed just in the last 2 years, there's a reason there was broad bipartisan opposition to it. And it's not because people don't realize the need for housing. They do. It is because there was no plan to actually address the real infrastructure needs of our municipalities. There was no cooperation and coordination with local governments in the best way to address these challenges. And so as we move forward, I'm hopeful what today's hearing will lend is some insights into what we can accomplish with sound fiscal and housing policies, both here in the Hudson Valley and around the country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Mr. Lawler. I'd also like to recognize Mr. Flood for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're a long way from Nebraska this morning, but it goes without saying that you have an exceptionally talented member of Congress representing you in Washington. I sit next to him, and you should be very proud of the representation that you're getting from someone that has hit the ground running and is proving himself every single day. So that's one of the main reasons I wanted to be here today, to have this conversation. Supervisor Kenny mentioned that 3.9 jobs were being created for every one housing unit, I believe, in her testimony. We have the same issue in my district, where we have, in the state of Nebraska, 80,000 open jobs. And our ability to fill those jobs rests solely on our ability to have the housing for them. And in the last 3 years, really since 2019, we've seen inflation of 16% in housing costs just to build. And on top of that, the interest rate now is hovering 7 to 9%, depending on the day. So I'm interested in talking about solutions for especially workforce housing. I am the author of a bill that is called Yes in My Backyard Act. Mr. Ketcham and I briefly touched on that before this hearing. I'd like to have the opportunity to unpack that. And I will tell you, as a member of Congress, I recently read about the significantly large number of indictments concerning housing in the city of New York. Accountability for people that manage Section 8 housing is absolutely necessary. It undermines our ability to care for the most vulnerable, make sure they have the right kind of housing, but also if we're failing in public housing, we're failing in America everywhere else. And so as a member of Congress, I applaud the work of the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York, and we are following this across the nation. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Mr. Flood. We'll now turn to member questions. I recognize myself for opening questions, and our hope is that we'll do at least 2 rounds through this, and we'll be a little more free-flowing with questions. But thank you for your opening statements and your expertise. Ms. Goodridge, I just want to follow up on one of the things you referenced in your opening statement about unregulated housing, and I thought everything's regulated in New York. So I just want to clarify, there are planning and zoning laws, there are some level of regulation. What do you mean when you say unregulated housing? Not subject to rent stabilization, not subject to price controls?
Not subject to rent stabilization.
Yeah, so not price-controlled housing.
For example, it might be a 2-family house that has an apartment. So, yes.
Okay, thanks. I just want to be clear. I would turn initially to Mr. Amicucci and Supervisor Kenny. So while expanding the supply of housing is obviously critical, it's equally important to recognize the sovereignty of local jurisdictions in making these decisions without heavy-handed effects of either state or federal authorities. Some people, I note that Martha's Vineyard doesn't want high-density housing, for example. And the people of that place should probably decide whether they have high-density housing, not someone from Washington, D.C. Lots of people agree with that, but they might feel differently about a suburb next to a city. Mr. Amicucci, could you speak to efforts at the state level in New York to implement high-density zoning and what communities have done in response? Well,
there's many communities in New York that are going to resist with high-density zoning, and I think if it's done intelligently, it's something that could be taken into consideration. The people that are looking to increase the number of units that we have in New York State, I think we should focus on the low-hanging fruit, where if you can relax some of the burdensome laws that have been passed in the last couple of years, I think that that would free up a lot of units and be able to accommodate, not everybody, but some of the people that are looking for housing. But as far as the zoning, I'm not a proponent of eliminating all zoning. I'm a proponent of being smarter with the zoning. Okay, I think that high-density zoning in certain areas might make sense.
But ultimately, the local government would make the decision on that.
Absolutely, that's not a federal. That's not a federal. I'm sorry.
Yeah, just so you know, I want to turn to Ms. Kinney so I get some input from everyone on this. And you're trying to grow jobs. There's lots of opportunities, but how, as a local government official, do you balance those decisions?
So I think one of the perfect examples is the talk of these ADUs, which were mentioned. 2 years ago, the governor was looking to basically mandate it. The local municipalities could not allow them. Basically was going to, we have all these environmental reviews and all these things required. That was going to be out the door. Anything to have these ADUs. So of interest is the town of Orangetown actually has an accessory dwelling unit on our books. If an owner in Orangetown lives in the house for 15 years, they're going to remain in part of the house. They can have an accessory dwelling unit. It's a way to keep our seniors in their home and afford it. The way it was being proposed from the state was, I could come in and buy a house that is basically a two-family without consideration for our parking, which we already have issues in parts of town, traffic, water, sewer, all the things that are local. So that's when I say that the state and federal government, to the extent there, needs to work with the local governments. There's things we can do. We have to be creative. And again, we're unique in Rockland County for having this on our books. So it's something that I would encourage the other municipalities
early movers,
to look at.
that is a growing option for a lot of folks to be able to add to density on single-family lots. And I'll just try to get a little time from you, Mr. Ketcham. You've experienced and researched the issue of bureaucracy in the administration of programs. To shed light on the problem, I introduced a bill that will establish an independent commission to reform HUD, to update some of the authorizations, to try to deal with benefit cliffs and standardized income and asset tests, things like that, problems that the people that administer these programs say impact their ability. So could you provide some examples at any level of government on the cost of bureaucracy and the disruption of the intended effect?
Thank you for the question. We can look to New York City for a good example in the ULURP process, which is triggered upon rezoning applications. That is a formally 7-month process, but it often takes much longer. It involves costly environmental reviews, and just going through that process can add up to $50,000 in the eventual cost of a housing unit that is built, not to mention the time that it takes. That's according to the Citizens Budget Commission. And so right there you are seeing the addition of costs to an already expensive housing market, where land value is already very high, where New York is a place where lots of people want to live because that is where the action is. That is where all the jobs are in the area. That is where opportunity is. So your land value is already going to be high. Your construction values are also going to be high. And if you layer on top of that additional bureaucratic costs, then you are going to make any type of housing you build out of reach of practically anyone. So the all-in cost of development can reach $3,000 to $4,000, and that's not adding in.
Puts the price out for a lot of people.
Precisely.
And then the answer for some is to spend more money and subsidize it with policy. So I'll turn back to you when I come back, but I want to kind of keep the things moving here with some of my colleagues. I'd recognize Mr. Flood from Nebraska for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ketcham, in your written testimony provided to the committee prior to today, you talked about homeowners as site value capitalists. Can you explain to me what you mean by that term?
Yes, thank you for the question. So I can relate it to the issue of ADUs. ADUs are an economically valuable entitlement to homeowners. They encourage homeowners to add more housing supply by granting them the ability to add supply where there is demand for it. And so this provides a property right. It provides the homeowners the freedom and the flexibility to use their properties in the way that they see fit, not the way that heavy-handed bureaucracies would have them see fit. So there is a balance here. The state and local governments need to work together to plan for growth. And sometimes when ADU restrictions are so onerous and that they prevent homeowners from adding this supply, well, then you're just not going to get that type of supply growth that you really need to move the needle to provide the growth and the economic opportunity that people are looking to obtain in moving to New York.
Following up on that, these environmental reviews, talk about what kind of a barrier they are. This is something I don't think we have in my part of the country, but talk about what is an environmental review and what is its impact on housing supply.
An environmental review is mandated under state law for instance, discretionary zoning actions, upzonings, and that means that within the process of upzoning, there is a months or even years-long requirement to study all of the environmental impacts, even for what could be a relatively mundane type of development. My colleague wrote a paper in 2020 looking at a very straightforward residential redevelopment. I believe it was a florist, and then they wanted to go up with housing. That took over 900 pages of environmental impact statements and reviews, and that only adds to the costs of new development. And those costs are going to be passed on to the eventual unit buyers or to the renters of that unit. So we need to find ways of making development costs feasible and to lower them so that more deals will pencil out and that those savings can then be passed along in the form of greater affordability to the eventual renters or home buyers.
Well, given the emphasis on environmental reviews, how do these reviews treat multifamily housing and creating denser neighborhoods, which by every argument would be more energy efficient? Do they reward multifamily housing, these environmental reviews?
Quite the contrary. In fact, they represent a bias in favor of the status quo because they essentially put the burden on new development without recognizing the risks of the status quo. If you do not build enough environmentally friendly multifamily housing in New York, you will divert population growth to other areas of the country that are more dependent on automobiles, less dependent on mass transit. So you are essentially not looking at the holistic environmental impact, but you're looking at only a very small regionalized impact, just a site-based impact, in fact. So I don't think it really makes a lot of sense to require these environmental impact statements for residential developments in the greenest city in the country, New York City.
Supervisor Kenny, I can see by your nonverbal that you have some comments here. And then,
No, I happen to agree. I think New York's requirement for a lot of the environmental reviews may be extreme in certain circumstances, but it does come down to balance because as someone who's representing the community that's already there, traffic, air quality, noise, all of those factors get looked at in the environmental review. And that's important for the neighbors that are there, so we just don't go in and say we need and again, I support the need for more housing and more dense housing in appropriate locations, but you just don't say we're going to disregard the environmental reviews because we need this, because ultimately the residents that are still there are the ones that are going to be coming out. They're sometimes the most vocal against these projects, but it's all about balance. It's enough of an environmental review so we're protecting the current residents, but not too much where we're prohibiting the builders from building and doing their job.
with the chairman's consent, I'd like to allow Ms. Goodridge to respond.
Sure, and I also wanted to piggyback and say that two things. So one, I think sometimes when people hear of environmental review, they think of only pollution and so forth and very strict environmental issues. But I just wanted to point out that it also includes things like school size. So sometimes a housing project may have 300 new units. and that might bring 1,000 families to a neighborhood, including many children. And the local schools might actually not have enough room for all of the new children that that housing project may bring. That's part of the environmental review, to assess of whether the local schools have enough room, have enough capacity. So that's really important. And I also wanted to point out that in New York, one of the proposals that the mayor has proposed, which hasn't passed as yet, is to limit environmental reviews for projects that are under 200 to 250, so that they don't have to go through environmental reviews. So that's something that's pending, but I did want to piggyback and say that it is vital, and I don't think that we should completely nix it.
I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Flood. I now recognize Mr. Lawler from New York for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nationwide, we're short about 6 million units and counting, and it's only growing by the year. In New York City right now, in large part due to rent control, they have about 50,000 vacant units because the cost of upgrading the unit to code is significantly more than you can recoup. And so what a lot of building owners are deciding to do is take the tax write-off, understandably. And so you have 50,000 vacant units in a city that desperately needs housing. We lead the nation, New York State does, in out-migration. And yet we still have a major housing crisis. Obviously, in an area like Rockland and Westchester, where we know we have the highest property taxes in America, and not through the fault of our municipalities or our local government. It is a function of the high cost of living in the suburbs. We have some of the best schools in the country here in our communities, but it costs money, and it continues to rise. The average home price over the last 4 years has increased by $400,000 in Westchester and $300,000 in Rockland. Now, part of that, as Supervisor Kenny pointed out, is a result of the out-migration from New York City during COVID, which severely limited the supply and jacked up the price. People were overbidding on the sale price by significant amounts of money, tens of thousands, to purchase the home. Supervisor Kenny, obviously, Rockland County is not New York City. We don't have any cities within Rockland County. It is primarily suburban. We do have, obviously, a number of villages, downtown business districts, but it's primarily single-family residential with some, high-density housing. But policies that may work in an urban center don't necessarily work in a community like ours. What are some of the things Orangetown has done in recent years to address some of the housing shortages, whether it is PAC zoning to build, senior living, whether it be rentals or purchase? But what are some of the things that Orangetown has been doing to try and actually build a housing stock while still respecting the suburban nature of the community?
Well, first of all, we did just go through the comprehensive plan, which for people who don't know, it's something that a municipality is supposed to do every roughly 10 years. Ours had not been done in roughly 25 years. So our comprehensive plan was so outdated. So we just updated it, and we put in all these ideas that we need to look at alternate, again, back to my comments, reinvent what we think is a home, We have these strip malls that are empty and these offices, so we're looking at allowing them to be developed into residential units, which would be great because it's repurposing a property that's already there. We do have our PAC zone, which is basically for 55 and older. It does have an affordability component. The builder will get more units if they, if they build a senior certain number, they get affordable. They have to give us affordable units. So we're taking steps. Unfortunately, it's just not really fast enough to keep up with the demand. But again, it goes back to I have made this a priority. I'm only in office a couple of years, and it is definitely front and center for me to find ways to create more housing units. again, without, again, we're not New York City, and as many of the residents like to tell me when we're talking about these things, we don't want to be New York City. So we have to find ways that work within the confines of Orangetown.
Mr. Ketcham, from the Manhattan Institute standpoint, what are some of the things that suburban communities can and should be looking at compared to, a more urban center where it might be, obviously easier to develop multi-family housing and/or obviously high-density housing when you're talking about high-rises and other types of housing?
Thank you for the question. Suburban communities, like other communities, value the character of their neighborhoods. And so they could look to build in gentle density that does not materially impact the existing character of a neighborhood. This is why ADUs are such an important and valuable tool in the arsenal of new housing supply. They can be put in the rear yard of an existing home or in a basement or attached to the dwelling. They do not materially change the look of the neighborhood, and they add density in the most gradual and gentlest way possible where there is demand for it, and give the homeowner the incentive to add the supply as well, so that you're turning a constituency that is ordinarily opposed to new housing supply in favor of it. That's one way. Another way is by lowering minimum lot sizes. So you can still combine lots, of course, but when lot sizes are too big, it has the effect of forcing home buyers to consume more land than they otherwise would, and thereby increase the cost of housing. So those are two ways of building density gently. There's also an argument to be made for transit-oriented development, but in a much narrower sense than what Governor Hochul proposed. It was too expansive and it was too dense into communities. So it was, for the Zone 1, it was 15 miles outside of the perimeter of the train stations. If you look to a state like Massachusetts, I believe that that would have been about a tenth of what the governor proposed. Because even if you take the center point of a train station and extend a half-mile radius around it per Governor Hochul's proposal, that would be about 500 acres. And Massachusetts has a TOD plan that only goes to, I believe, 50 acres or thereabouts. So there is a role for the potential, like for suburban communities to build in more transit or more housing near transit, but in a gentle and contextually appropriate way.
And Mr. Chairman, if I may just respond to that. I think part of, and I would agree both on TODs and accessory dwelling units, but part of it is for the state to incentivize as opposed to mandate. So a TOD, we actually under the prior supervisor looked at the potential of a TOD in Pearl River, where I live, and in part to help beautify the downtown district and incentivize property owners to, reface the buildings. Potentially, they could add on apartments on top of their existing commercial property, which could be positive for them, obviously, from the standpoint of rental income, et cetera, and benefit the town in terms of having additional units, which also helps a downtown business district thrive because you need people there. You need people to come into the stores. But the accessory dwelling unit legislation that was proposed would mandate every municipality, as the supervisor pointed out, without any understanding or foresight into how that would impact traffic, sewer, water, police, fire, schools. And so that is part of the problem here. And I think the other aspect of what that law would have done, it would not have required the homeowner to live on the property after 1 year. And so to me, it's how do we incentivize it? Incentivize municipalities. What are we doing as a state to help invest in the infrastructure? New York State got 10% of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. The monies are coming to New York State, $100 billion to help with infrastructure. We should be utilizing that money to help incentivize municipalities to help with the housing stock.
I thank you, Mr. Lawler. I recognize myself for another round of questions. We'll hopefully have at least one more round after this. But I kind of want to pick up on HUD and kind of tying together HUD, which is focusing on the whole country, and what we were talking about with planning and zoning. I mean, frankly, is there anyone who believes that local planning and zoning laws shouldn't prevail over state or federal zoning laws? I don't think on the panel anyone does. They're advocates for that. The reality is policies get brought up, just like the one Mr. Lawler said, that do reach past that. And then certainly some of the policies aren't just planning and zoning policies. So picking up where I left off with you, Mr. Ketcham, are there, and maybe for the panel, are there specific issues at the local level where we should be aware that relate to HUD or federal agency policies that are impacting the ability for local communities to make their own decisions?
Thank you for the question. The most cost-effective use of HUD dollars is in rental vouchers, that kind of subsidy, rather than subsidizing project-based affordable housing development, which tends not to go quite as far. There was a tax foundation report that found that low-income housing tax credit developments were more costly than private market developments. So if you allow the private market to build and then expand voucher subsidies, you would get the best of both worlds. So it's a matter of looking for the most cost-effective use of HUD dollars, and vouchers tend to be the best use of that.
Thank you. Mr. Amicucci.
Yes, I totally agree with Mr. Ketcham. You have a bill, the Choice in Affordable Housing Act, that is floating around in Congress and in the Senate right now. Iram and myself and a lot of people that I'm associated with would absolutely support that and think that that would be a great way to go. We think that increasing the number of Section 8 vouchers around the country would absolutely help the lower income, which is the area of expertise that I have. I deal with a lot of low-income families. I have 48 units, 90% are Section 8. A lot of my counterparts don't like to deal with Section 8 because of some of the onerous requirements that are put on them. I think if we can address that, I think that would incentivize more use of vouchers. And I would just like to address a statement that Congressman Lawler made, was that there's 50,000 units that are available or that are not available in New York State as a result of rent control. Rent control has something to do with it, but more importantly, it was the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act of 2019 that resulted in those 50,000 units being unoccupied. Okay, those created enormous disincentives to owners to invest in apartment units. And what's happening and what will happen is you're going to have a housing stock similar to NYCHA, which I would like to address a comment that Congressman Flood made. You used public housing in Section 8 in the same breath. Public housing is different than Section 8. Section 8 is Section 8, and public housing in New York is what we consider NYCHA, okay? And that is not an example of what we should be doing. NYCHA is the largest landlord in the city of New York, and they do not follow their own rules. And that's not what we want to purport. Section 8, if done in a proper way, will incentivize better housing stock and, in my opinion, more housing stock, both in New York and throughout the country.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that, you look at Section 8, it does put the voucher in the hands of the person that's selecting where they would live. It does a lot of flexible things that a central planner can't do. And just while we're on the subject of NYCHA, really the New York Public Housing Authority isn't uniquely bad, but it is certainly bad. There are lots of problems there. In fact, someone came into my office and suggested that we could turn them into communes and have actual communists run them, and it would improve the conditions because the people that live there would at least take care of the place. You have lots of units that aren't actually available to be used, and this is the same in D.C. Public Housing Authority. So I questioned Secretary Fudge about that, and we're paying for things that we aren't getting. and it's not been very effective. So, would anyone want to comment on the challenges of administering some of these programs? Because HUD, frankly, isn't paying enough attention to these, and you're seeing criminal prosecutions because they're actual criminal activity in some of these public housing authorities, and unfortunately some of it is going unprosecuted, and the people that we're intending to help are the people that aren't being helped.
Exactly. Yes. Chairman Davidson, I totally agree with what you're saying there. And again, I don't want to harbor on NYCHA, but Section 8, in my opinion, if properly done, would solve not all problems, but a lot of the problems that exist in the more denser populated areas. And again, a lot of these development issues that have been spoken about on the panel, they're difficult to do. Development is difficult. It's very difficult to do. But if we can go after the low-hanging fruit and maybe relax some of the onerous legislation that is currently on the books, I think we can pick up some housing units with the low-hanging fruit.
I can think of a couple flow charts that show how if you rent under this conditions with a voucher program, it's different than other Section 8 programs, and we are looking at legislation to streamline that. I believe one of the acts, the Choice Act that you referenced, would be helpful in streamlining some of that.
Also, the point that you made about putting the money in the hands of the tenants, sometimes they don't do the right things with the money, and the rent doesn't get paid, and then they're facing eviction. Okay, and I'm going to tell you, I'm a landlord, and I've had to evict people, unfortunately, and I've had to evict people who have a criminal record, and the fear in their eyes of being evicted from their home versus facing a police officer putting handcuffs on them is mind-boggling. Okay, the fear of losing your home is incredible. Okay, it's a fear that a lot of people, thank God, don't have to experience. But I have had the disappointing opportunity to be able to witness this. And so instead of passing a Earned Income Act where you give the federal dollars directly to the tenants, maybe you increase the vouchers that are out there. There are municipalities that
it strikes a different balance.
The city of Yonkers has 7,000 a waiting list of Section 8 vouchers. They're no longer accepting applications because they can't do it. But these vouchers are gold. If they're used in the right way, they're gold, and they guarantee that the rent is being paid. So whatever else the tenant is doing, that person is going to be pretty much guaranteed that they're going to have a roof over their head. And that's a basic need that everybody has.
Thank you for that. I now recognize Mr. Flood for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Amicucci, let's just talk for a second about Section 8 housing. Prior to this hearing beginning, I spoke with somebody that was here in the audience, and he was telling me about a situation where a landlord accepted Section 8 housing for what was supposed to be a short respite stay in a hotel, and that these folks were living in filth, that there were drug dealers among folks that weren't drug dealers that were vulnerable, and that they was getting paid $350 a week. Who do you go to report that, to get that cleaned up, and does it get cleaned up in this state?
It does. In this state, it does. And
he didn't seem to think so. So
well, the people
who do you call?
Who do you call? You call the public housing agency that's responsible for that Section 8 voucher. Every Section 8 voucher is issued by a local public housing.
And they will follow up and they will solve that.
Well, here's what will happen. You're required to have a yearly inspection, okay? When I turn over a Section 8 housing unit to Section 8 and accept their federal dollars, I give it to them in pristine condition. Has to be, otherwise it won't pass inspection, okay? Every year that unit gets inspected, okay? Checks for smoke detectors, for...
What if there have been like 1,500 calls to this unit over the course of 12 months? Do they look at that?
Well, I can't speak for everybody, but they should be. They should be.
Are they?
I guess it depends on...
I'm not interested in your opinion. I'm interested in what you know as fact.
Sometimes they don't follow up.
Okay.
Sometimes they don't follow up.
Can you explain the difference for me in New York between rent control and rent stabilization?
Yes. Rent control was established right after World War II, okay? And it actually was a federal mandate across the country because soldiers were coming back from World War II, and there had been a lack of development around the country for housing units. And unfortunately, scrupulous landlords took advantage of that and raised the rent, and our veterans coming back from, saving us from the Nazis had no place to live. So the government felt that we had to put some controls on the rising cost of rent. Now, in 99% of the municipalities out there, rent control went away. It sunsetted, okay? But in New York, it stayed. Subsequently to that, in 1974, New York and Westchester and some other communities in New York State passed what they call the Rent Stabilization Act, okay, which is rent regulation, okay? So it's different than rent control, but it does the same thing. At some point, it actually the Rent Stabilization Act of 1974, which is a New York State act, is actually worse than rent control, because with rent control, you actually, if you have a rent control unit, after every 2 years, you get a higher percentage of increase than you would under the Rent Stabilized Act that was passed in New York. So that was passed in the 70s to try to further curtail the rising cost of rents in New York City and some other municipalities.
Thank you. I want to ask Supervisor Kenny and maybe Ms. Goodridge, manufactured housing is something that our GSEs, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, say is a priority for them to address the housing crisis because it's more affordable for working families to get into manufactured housing. I think it's a real option in states like mine. My concern for you is your land is so much more expensive here than it is in a rural state. So could you, Ms. Kenny, speak to that? And when I'm talking about manufactured housing, I'm talking about homes with a pitched roof. I'm not talking about trailers. I'm talking, and I think there's a development in Hagerstown, Maryland, where they're really going deep on this, and it's a real option for working families. Is this something that would be attractive to you as a local leader?
Well, I'm certainly willing to consider any options that would help with the problem. But I will say, just as a coincidence, a lot came up, a vacant lot not far from my house. It's an acre. They're asking $695,000. $695,000. I don't know if they're going to get it, but that is going back to the cost of land and how valuable it's become. Certainly something we can look at. I know it's been used in the past by individual property owners, like someone maybe would buy that and it would be more, to put a prefab up, maybe more cost effective. But yeah, I don't think it's prohibited in my town, in the code. I know some of my neighbors have done the prefab houses. Certainly something to look at, but again, it goes back to the issue of the cost of the land.
One comment before I go to Ms. Goodridge and for her opinion is, in my home state, we have this thing called tax increment financing, where if you purchase this $695,000 lot, you could basically not pay property taxes for the next 15 years, and you could use what your property tax bill would be on the improved, actually, and you pay that, but it pays down a bond that the city uses to put streets and make good things happen in that area. Do you have any tools like that in the state of New York available to you?
Not that I'm aware of. They will pay property taxes on that. I mean, they will be paying it on it, but it's also based upon the value, and usually that's based upon the construction. In this case, so the taxes will be much lower. There's only, unless you start getting into the business arena where they're bringing jobs and there's all sorts of incentives there. But for a single family home or even a two-family home, you're not going to get it now.
Ms. Goodridge, you want to respond?
My mind went immediately to back in old times when Sears used to ship the home. Yeah, I obviously I'm open to all kinds of housing measures, and in New York in particular, I'm a tenants' rights attorney, but a lot of my clients, including myself, we advocate for more home ownership. And unfortunately, it's very difficult to be a homeowner. In New York, in order to be a homeowner, it's a lot of co-ops and condos, and so more housing would be helpful. I wonder if it's okay if I address some issues about rent stabilization.
Sure.
Sure. So one issue, we were discussing a bit about rent stabilization before, and often it's one of the main criticisms is that there is no means testing. And I also wanted to point out that for NYCHA, New York City Housing Authority, that's often also criticized, even though that's means testing. NYCHA has a lot of problems, obviously, but one of its main problems historically is that it hasn't been fully funded as it should be. It needs more. A lot of the disrepair is because it needs more money to be fully funded. When it was originally put into place, a lot of thinking around it was that this was a temporary measure, and obviously poverty, unfortunately, doesn't last 5 years like what was thought for public housing. I also wanted to quickly address and just say that we do need a mix of housing. Rent stabilization is important. Every single housing doesn't need to be rent stabilized, but it's important that we have a mix. For example, Section 8 was mentioned. There's been a measure, and I mention that because there's been a measure to move all types of housing to private. So Section 8, for example, a lot of my clients, they have Section 8. A lot of landlords don't take Section 8. They'll flat out say, I don't take Section 8, even though that's unlawful. There are lots of reports about this, lots of lawsuits. And so while we do want to increase Section 8 and we want to fund it, we also have to be honest and cognizant about the fact that even that form often has its challenges. I see a question coming. Oh, okay. And then
can I ask you a quick question, and then I'll yield back here?
Yes.
I talked to Mr. Amicucci about abuse of Section 8 housing by landlords. Have you seen this? Is it remedied? Do they take it seriously?
So I was going to say, so let's say that there's a Section 8 tenant, like I think you mentioned earlier, and then there are issues in the building. If that tenant goes to that PHA, the public, or the housing provider that's Section 8, and they say, well, my neighbor's doing this or this is happening, they're going to tell them, go and talk to your landlord. And if they go and talk to their landlord, it's really just hit or miss if they're going to do anything, and some do and some don't. So in my experience, the housing authority that runs Section 8, and that, in New York could be NYCHA, it could be HUD, it could be HPD, there are various types of Section 8. In terms of the wider problems, that is going to go back to the landlord, and if a tenant raises them, they're almost going to be laughed at and say, well, go and talk to your landlord. What are you talking to us about this for?
Okay, I yield back.
Thanks, Mr. Flood. I now recognize Mr. Lawler for questions.
So there's no question we want to help those who need the assistance. And I think obviously there are programs both through HUD and in New York State to do that. But to just highlight the absurdity of some of this, my former colleague in the New York State Assembly, Linda Rosenthal, who serves as the chair of the Assembly Housing Committee, is getting a rent-stabilized apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan for $1,573.37 a month. She inherited this apartment from her grandmother and the rent-stabilized cost with it. Now, she's making $142,000 a year at minimum, and the reason I know that is because that's the salary of a New York State Assembly member. It's absurd that somebody who's making $142,000 a year is frankly in a rent-stabilized apartment that they inherited from their grandmother. And that's some of the absurdity of the law when you're actually looking at people who need the benefit versus those who don't, and actually how that is limiting the supply for people who need it. And so when yes, the 2019 laws are what dramatically impacted the vacancy units, the number of vacant units in New York City. There's no question about that. But to me, we should be helping those who need it. And when I look at NYCHA, I served on the Housing Committee in the State Assembly. I was one of only 4 members to vote against that NYCHA overhaul, which to me was nothing more than a scam. It was shifting the assets from one entity to another so that they could get more money from the federal government. They have done nothing to actually fix the problems at NYCHA. I think we had the Inspector General of HUD in earlier this year. I asked her in testimony, have you met with the monitor at NYCHA? No. Meanwhile, you have over 70 people arrested just a few weeks ago because of the corruption that goes on at NYCHA. And I don't think it's fair to the residents of NYCHA. I don't think it's fair to the people who rely on public housing. We want them to be living in a safe environment, in an apartment that is up to code, that is quality, that has all the amenities that they should receive as part of that. And so, to me, part of this is looking at what we're currently doing and how to fix it. Not just complain about it or point the problem out with it, but how to fix it. And I think we have to look at a lot more at public-private partnership on this. I think if we're talking about NYCHA, I think NYCHA needs a complete overhaul, including potentially looking at bringing in private investment to help. Because I don't think there's just not enough tax money to deal with this in the New York City Housing Authority. In addition to that, you look at, I just met with a gentleman from Florida who owns over 100 acres of land in a major city just outside of Miami. Now, right in the downtown. And it is currently a mobile home park. And there are nearly 1,000 mobile homes in this park. And he is now building exclusively affordable housing in partnership with the municipality, inclusive of building a new police station, a new city hall, a new community center, a new charter school. Now, that's the type of innovative thinking we need to be looking at, and that will work in an urban environment. It may not work exactly like that up in the suburbs or in a rural area, but that's the type of innovative public-private partnership that we need to be focused on if we're going to address the housing shortfall. So he's going to go from 900 units, basically, to tens of thousands of units in the same area, and it'll be exclusively affordable housing. I think that's a pretty impressive model. And so the question to me is, how do we fix the problem in New York City, in particular with NYCHA and the public housing challenge that we see there?
Okay, I am
a lot to unpack there. Right?
Very, very, very happy that this has been brought up because I have a lot to say. So thank you so much for the question. Mm-hmm. So the first is, you mentioned Assemblymember Rosenthal's salary, I guess, is $143,000. But I want to point out, and this is what you said for a rent-stabilized apartment, it's $143,000, and the rent is around $1,500. But I want to point out that under the federal standards right now for affordable housing, did you know that it goes up to, for one person, $165,000 for just one person for an affordable income-restricted apartment? This is what I raised before about how you have these income-restricted so-called low-income housing, even under the federal standards, and there are people who they will set the standards, they will set the low income at $80,000 to be able to access this housing, and sometimes it goes up to nearly $160,000. So if it isn't okay for an assembly member to do it, then why is that the actual federal standard right now? That's my question. This is something that I raise, that people come up to me all of the time and say affordable housing right now is a scam. I make $30,000 as an Uber driver, and I'm not eligible to even get into so-called low-income housing.
I have this argument with my colleagues all the time, especially pertaining to the cap on salt, for instance. Mm-hmm. If you're making $200,000 as a family, okay, in New York, that's about a cop and a teacher, all right, on their salary combined. And to be able to afford to live in an area like this is extremely expensive. But I'm not getting a subsidy from the federal government on it or the state government on it to purchase my home. And so I think part of the challenge here is the numbers are certainly all over the place in terms of what somebody would qualify for or why. But $142,000 is significantly higher than, the median average in this country as part of as far as the salary goes, and certainly in the state of New York and certainly in the city. So if she's in a rent-stabilized apartment and you're looking at where everybody else is, that to me is part of the challenge here. And so if you own the building, what are you supposed to do when your taxes continue to go up, when utilities continue to go up, and you can only charge X amount? We have a real crisis here across the board, both in terms of the people who own the buildings being able to afford them, as well as then obviously people being able to afford rent.
Yeah. And what I'm saying is they're everyday New Yorkers, aside from one assembly member who make even more than that salary.
Oh, agreed.
And they're eligible for affordable housing, and people who make extremely low income are not. And I think it's very problematic, and it needs to be fixed. In terms of NYCHA, let me just point out, I've actually sued NYCHA a bunch of times, so I'm not I'm not
You're
like the
intimately familiar.
spokesperson for NYCHA. But again, it needs to be it needs to be funded. That is the main issue. It needs to be funded. The residents validly complain about it being in disrepair, and a lot of that is, there are other models that's been explored right now about privatizing it and all of it.
But do you think there's maybe not privatizing it completely, but do you think that there's a way to get a public-private partnership that would actually address the problem? Because I'll just tell you, having served on the Housing Committee in Albany, now on the Housing Committee down in Washington, I don't think the problems are just money at NYCHA. I think it is far bigger than that, and that there needs to be a real overhaul in the way that it's looked at.
Certainly, there needs to be an overhaul in the entire housing agency, but money is at the source of a lot of the issues. Even with amazing management, with the best person that could possibly lead NYCHA, at the end of the day, it's still going to have black mold, as a lot of my clients have. It's still going to have mushrooms growing out. They're still going to have no heat, no hot water in the dead of winter, even with an A-plus person running it.
I mean, they need to be completely overhauled.
Right, and the source of that is going to be investing in it, which I just wanted to point out that the Housing Crisis Response Act is a move in the right direction with $150 billion to invest in fair and affordable housing.
Thanks, Mr. Lawler. I recognize myself for a round of questions. This will be the last round that we have, so we'll each take one more round of questions. A lot of what we're talking about is math, and I always enjoyed math as a student, and I remember this idea of, you solve an equation, you try to fix as many of the variables as possible and focus on one of them. And a lot of this is dynamic, so we're trying to solve all the variables at the same time. And into this mix of demand exceeding supply, we're adding extra demand because we have a large influx of new residents, new people in our country, not citizens, not people that are legally here, people who are coming into our country illegally. So Supervisor Kenny, you testified last year about how the crisis at our southern border is creating burdens for local communities across the country. Can you talk specifically about what has transpired between your Orangetown, New York, and New York City Mayor Eric Adams when the city tried to house hundreds of undocumented migrants in an Orangetown hotel?
It was 340 single male adults. That was the number that they were looking to house in a hotel in Orangetown, which the town obtained, took legal action and prevented it. So we are actually still in court in two legal matters, basically with lawyers being paid by New York City on that matter. But what we are seeing still, and it's part of the cause and effect, I guess, is what we've started to see is homes being purchased by investors, and we are finding multiple families living in there. And it's sad because it's not safe. The town of Clarkstown, which we're in right now, they had 15 homes that had multiple families, most of them migrants, living in the basement, living in rooms with crock pots or whatever they had to do, whatever. So they had to get administrative warrants and go in. We in Orangetown are just starting to see it. We have identified 2 or 3 homes that we are seeing that, we're getting calls that there's, too many people living in the house. And so it is another issue we have with landlords. A lot of landlords, whether they're a BlackRock or an individual buying multiple homes, and then sticking as many people in there as they can. So it is definitely something that the municipalities...
Kind of at odds with the intent of the local zoning, right?
Exactly.
So do you think it's a good use of taxpayer resources to have to spend money to challenge mandates of these kind of powerful government programs, or frankly, in the case of some of the federal policy, actually violations of federal law that say that some of these folks shall be detained, shall be deported, and yet they're being transported all over the country, showing up in communities and confronting local governments with challenges like you're facing. So not only are we spending the resources at the federal level, it's causing local governments to spend resources as well, right?
Yeah. Even worse, New York State has given New York City, I gave up with the number, but $2 billion plus or whatever. And they're using those dollars to hire lawyers to sue local municipalities. I think those dollars would be way better spent to deal with the problem in New York City than trying to force municipalities who are not equipped for it. We don't have housing to defend ourselves. So it definitely, to me, is almost a slap in the face to all the taxpayers of Orangetown that our taxpayers are going to sue us. But
yeah, I think people in Ohio have been encouraged by seeing the reaction in places like New York and even New York City, where people are recognizing, oh wow, this really isn't sustainable. I mean, you're talking about what would be, around the 10th largest state if all of these new illegal immigrants into the United States under the Biden administration were in one place. It would be like a 10th largest state. I mean, this is at a scale that is unprecedented, and at a scale that is not sustainable. And it's the same kinds of challenges that we talked about with planning and zoning. And when you have massive influx of demand, these people need to live somewhere. It far outpaces what was already a problem, even without it. So communities are being confronted with unsustainable challenges in a lot of ways, as the need for supply of housing is hard to keep up with the demand. If you see great economies, the job growth is outpacing the ability for housing to be constructed. And into this, you drop 10 million extra people. And America already has a planning and zoning system for new residents. We recognize about 1 million new citizens legally every year. And it's a fair debate whether we should do it illegally or not. But I just wanted to highlight the impact on housing of this extra surge. So thanks for your prior work on it. Good luck with resolving your lawsuits with your state, and hopefully we'll have success in turning off the fire hydrant. We went down to the border. I think all 3 of us were down there in January with the speaker, and we were highlighting the problem. And we didn't necessarily need another trip to the border to highlight the problem. People know that the border system is broken. But one of the folks that we were talking to was saying, we don't need more buckets to catch more water. We need somebody to turn off the fire hydrant. And there's just a massive flow in. So some of the proposals deal with just spend more money. And the reality is you got to get to the root cause. In the case of securing our border, come through the lawful ports of entry, enter our country legally, that can be done. I hope we do it. And I think it will have some impact on local communities with the cost and availability of housing. With that, I'd recognize Mr. Flood.
Thank you, Mr. Davidson. I think Mr. Lawler made a good point about the difference in Rockland County compared to a lot of other counties in the United States. Your median household income is $106,000 with an average home price of $609,000, where the county I live in has an average home price of about $175,000 and our median income is about $60,000. So everything is relative. And so Supervisor Kenny, that doesn't mean you don't have working poor or poverty in Rockland County. Do you have an issue with dilapidated homes of your existing housing stock in your town of Orangetown, or can you speak even to the greater Rockland County area?
I can speak to Orangetown. I mean, the Rockland County, even though we're a small county, we're very distinct towns. You will find Clarkstown and Orangetown are probably the most similar situated. We do have our fair share of homes that, whether it's a senior in there that just can't take care of it, or it's been foreclosed on and is a zombie home. And then the municipality we do have a process in place for property maintenance and to improve the properties and things like that when it happens. So fortunately in Orangetown, it's not an overwhelming problem. I think if you move to other communities within Rockland County, you will find that problem. But I just want to say, I was in Lincoln, Nebraska, and I'm ready. How much was that price of a house? I'm ready to come.
Lincoln's median income a little higher.
Okay.
Not that high, though. But, well, one thing I would offer to you is, we run into this issue, too, especially with the silver tsunami coming with an older population that are fixed income on Social Security or whatever retirement they have. As energy prices rise, one of the things that I've found that is underutilized, and the federal government commits a lot of resources to weatherization. And weatherization programs and the USDA programs and the other federal programs that are available will do anything from put new siding on a house to a new door to a new heating and air conditioning system to new windows. And new windows make a home look like it's brand new. And I think it's twofold. It helps that maybe senior citizen on a fixed income lower their monthly energy costs by, maybe $100, $200, which is real money. But it also improves the neighborhood, and suddenly when that house in the neighborhood looks better, the person owning the next worst looking house starts to up their game. And I just wondered if there's been a conversation about using these very underutilized weatherization programs that are available through all sorts of different federal agencies.
I would say from the local standpoint, we have not. It's actually the first time I'm hearing of it, so there you go. It's obviously underutilized. We do have a lot of county and state programs to help with either the heating costs and more like that, the water, so they keep their essential services going. But I'm not aware of any where they help with the roofs or the windows. So.
Well, one of the best things about multifamily or even duplex housing is that once we move an elderly, maybe a widow or a widower, out of that home, it frees it up for a family to come in and take advantage of that home so that we can welcome more families in and still take care of our more mature population. So you have a unique set of challenges here, and land cost is something, wrapping my head around it, I don't know how you provide that affordable housing without some creativeness. So with that, thank you to everybody. This has been very informative, and again, thank you for the invitation, Mr. Davidson and Mr. Lawler, for being here. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Lawler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to go back to Mr. Amicucci. You mentioned a few items that you think would be helpful: the Choice and Affordability Housing Act, expanding the low-income housing tax credit, incentivize adaptive reuse of underutilized commercial properties, among other things. One of the things that I've talked to a number of people about has to do with opportunity zones and expanding it to allow for ordinary income as opposed to only capital gains. What are your thoughts on that?
Actually not too familiar with the opportunity zones around the state, but I think that anything that you can do.
So this was under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from 2017. The opportunity zones allow for you to deduct on the capital gains only.
Right.
And so most people who own multifamily housing, for instance, are mom and pop.
Right.
It's the local cop and teacher who invested in a rental property or whatever the case, but they're mostly on ordinary income. And so the question is, and Mr. Ketcham, maybe you have some thoughts on this as well. Would this be beneficial to allow, as opposed to just capital gains, to allow for ordinary income to be deducted?
Well, of course it would be beneficial. Again, it's like when you have a loss on a or a paper loss on a property that you own, the federal tax laws don't allow you only up to $25,000 to deduct any of those losses against your ordinary income. And also, if you're making over $150,000 a year, which most people in this area, even just to have some sort of sustenance, have to do, then you don't get any benefit from it, and you just get it as a carryover. There's only $3,000 that you can deduct, and then you carry it forward for as long as the loss occurs. But if you can have a deduction against your taxable income for any ordinary income that you have, I think that would be very beneficial to the individual homeowners.
If I may add.
Yes, please.
I believe that would be a helpful policy because you would essentially be expanding the capital available to increase housing supply. It is not that dissimilar to the tax incentive program, formerly known as 421A in New York State, where the city is foregoing tax revenues on rental properties, large rental developments, in order that they be built, because they would not pencil out unless there is some tax incentive there, given the property tax structure in New York City that disproportionately burdens large rental developments compared to co-ops, condos, and small homes. So the question is, how are you going to make the most use of federal dollars to increase housing supply? And you can do so through direct subsidy, but you can also take cash streams like foregone tax revenues and roll that into the capital stock available to build more supply. And so in that way, I think that it would prove helpful.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for hosting today's hearing here in Rockland County. And thank you to all of our witnesses for participating in it. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lawler, for drawing us here to New York. We had plans to do a field hearing, and for the benefit of the audience, Mr. Lawler said, please pick New York. We have a lot of issues to highlight. And I want to thank our witnesses for your testimony today, and frankly, he's proven accurate. There have been a lot of benefits to coming out here for the field. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their responses. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as able if these are in fact sent. This hearing is now adjourned.